How does a man born in the quiet provinces, saddled with debt and driven by a thirst for personal success, transform himself into the thundering, indomitable voice of one of history's most chaotic and transformative events? This is the central, searing question in the life of George Danton. His journey is not merely the story of one individual, but a reflection of the French Revolution itself, its soaring aspirations, its brutal pragmatism, and its terrifying capacity to consume its own children. To understand Danton is to understand the raw, untamable energy that first shattered a monarchy and then, in its relentless pursuit of an imagined utopia, began to devour itself. He was a man of colossal appetites and even more colossal influence, a figure who could rally a panicked nation with the sheer force of his rhetoric, yet whose own life would ultimately be extinguished by the very revolutionary flames he so masterfully fanned. His story is a timeless and cautionary tale of power, ambition, and the perilous moment when a revolution's ideals curdle into dogma, and its heroes become its designated traitors. Before the roar of the revolutionary tribune echoed through the streets of Paris, there was simply George Danton, an ambitious young lawyer hailing from Arcis-sur-Aube in the Champagne region of northeastern France. He was not born into the Parisian elite or steeped in radical philosophy from birth. Instead, he was a product of the provincial bourgeoisie, a family with just enough standing to provide him with a solid education, but not enough wealth to grant him an easy path to prominence. His early years were marked by a boisterous energy and a series of minor accidents that would shape his unforgettable appearance. An encounter with a bull left his face scarred and his nose flattened. A later bout of smallpox further pocked his features. These were not the features of a classical hero, but they contributed to an image of rugged authenticity that would later endear him to the working people of Paris, the sans-culotte. He was a man who looked like he had lived, like he had fought, and this gave him a credibility that the more polished, academic revolutionaries often lacked. His early ambition was not yet political. It was profoundly personal and, in many ways, conventional for a man of his time and station. When Danton finally arrived in the sprawling, chaotic metropolis of Paris in the 1780s, it was not with a spirit ignited by revolutionary fire, but with a more practical and worldly desire for wealth, status, and the myriad pleasures the capital city had to offer. He borrowed heavily to purchase the office of an advocate in the prestigious King's Council, a move that plunged him into significant debt but gave him a legitimate foothold in the Parisian legal world. This initial phase of his life reveals a man driven by earthly ambitions. He was a bon vivant, a lover of fine wine, hearty food, and the company of women. He sought to build a comfortable life, to establish his family, and to make a name for himself within the existing structures of the Ancien Regime. The grand, abstract ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity were not yet the central pillars of his existence. Instead, he was a pragmatist, a striver, a man keenly aware of the power of money and connections, navigating the intricate social and professional ladders of a society that was, unbeknownst to him and everyone else, teetering on the brink of complete and utter physically. Danton was a force of nature, a presence that was impossible to ignore. He was a giant of a man with a broad, powerful build that commanded attention the moment he entered a room. His face, a testament to a rugged and challenging youth, was famously described by his contemporaries as ugly, yet it possessed a strange and compelling magnetism. Scarred by smallpox and disfigured from childhood encounters with farm animals, his features were rough and asymmetrical, yet they were animated by a vitality and intelligence that captivated all who met him. But his most formidable physical attribute was his voice. It was a resonant, thunderous instrument, capable of rising above the din of a crowded assembly or the roar of a street mob, and of projecting power, passion, and unwavering conviction. This voice, combined with his imposing stature and his complete lack of pretense, made him a figure of immense charisma. He did not speak in the carefully constructed, philosophically dense prose of his rival Robespierre. He spoke the language of the people with raw emotion, directness, and a potent, often crude, wit. This unique combination of a powerful intellect, a commanding physical presence, and a deeply relatable personality made him utterly captivating to the common people of Paris. While other revolutionary leaders often appeared as distant, almost priestly figures, Danton seemed like one of them. He was a man who understood their passions, their fears, and their desires because he shared them. His love for life, his well-known appetites, and his disdain for aristocratic airs made him approachable and trustworthy. The artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers of the city saw in him not an ideologue seeking to impose a rigid system of virtue upon them, but a patriot who would fight for their interests with every fibre of his being. He could be seen in the cafes, his booming laughter filling the room, and he could be seen in the political clubs, his powerful words stirring the hearts of his listeners. This profound connection with the Parisian masses was the foundational pillar of his political power, a living wellspring of support that he could call upon in the revolution's most desperate hours to turn the tide of history. Danton's political journey, his transformation from an ambitious lawyer into a revolutionary titan, began in earnest within the radical crucible of the Cordeliers Club. Situated in a district teeming with artisans, journalists, and working-class Parisians, the Cordeliers was one of the most radical and democratic political clubs of the early revolution. It was here, amongst his neighbours and constituents, that Danton found his true calling. The club provided the perfect stage for his particular genius. It was a place of fiery, spontaneous debate, where ornate, prepared speeches were less valued than the ability to think on one's feet and capture the mood of the audience in the moment. Here, Danton honed his skills as a powerful, impromptu orator, learning to channel the anger, hopes, and anxieties of the people into electrifying political action. He became the district's favorite son, their champion, the man whose voice could articulate their deepest grievances and transform them into a coherent and formidable political force. The Cordeliers Club was his training ground, his power base, and the springboard from which he would launch himself onto the national stage. By the summer of 1792, the French Revolution had reached a precipice of existential crisis. The initial optimism of 1789 had evaporated, replaced by paranoia, division, and the looming threat of foreign invasion. The monarchies of Europe, horrified by the radical turn of events in France, had formed a coalition to crush the revolution and restore King Louis XVI to his full powers. The Prussian and Austrian armies were massing on the borders, and their commander, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto threatening the utter destruction of Paris if any harm came to the royal family. Panic gripped the capital. The government seemed paralyzed, caught between radical factions and royalist sympathizers. It was a moment of supreme peril, a point at which the entire revolutionary project could have been extinguished. The question on everyone's lips was a desperate one. With foreign armies at the gates of Paris and the nation on the verge of collapse, how could one man's voice, however powerful, possibly save the revolution from certain and ignominious doom? In this moment of supreme crisis, George Danton did not just speak, he acted. He became the architect and the embodiment of the people's righteous fury. While others debated and dithered, Danton, now a leading figure in the insurrectionary Paris Commune, understood that the monarchy had become a rallying point for counter-revolution and a fatal liability in the war against foreign invaders. He argued forcefully that the time for compromise was over. He was a key force in helping to orchestrate the momentous and bloody assault on the Tuileries Palace on August 10th in 1792. This was not a spontaneous riot. It was a planned insurrection. Danton's powerful oratory and organizational skills were crucial in mobilizing the National Guard and the federated troops from the provinces, uniting them with the radical sans-culottes of Paris. The storming of the Tuileries was a brutal, violent affair that resulted in the massacre of the king's Swiss guards and effectively shattered the French monarchy, which had existed for 1,000 years. It was a point of no return, an act of audacious defiance that Danton had both championed and enabled. With the king deposed and imprisoned, and the enemy armies advancing relentlessly towards Paris, a new wave of fear swept the city. It was in this atmosphere of dread and desperation, in a speech delivered to the Legislative Assembly in early September 1792, that Danton uttered the words that would define his legacy and electrify a nation. As Minister of Justice, he took to the tribune to galvanize the deputies and the people to an unprecedented war effort. De l'audace, encore de l'audace, toujours de l'audace, et la France est sauvée, he thundered. We need audacity, and yet more audacity, and always audacity, and France will be saved. This was not merely a speech, it was a weapon, a rallying cry that cut through the fog of fear and despair. It was a call to arms that resonated in every corner of the nation, inspiring a surge of volunteerism and a spirit of defiant resistance. His words capture the essence of the revolutionary spirit required at that moment, a complete rejection of timid half-measures and a full-throated embrace of bold, decisive, and even ruthless action in the defense of the homeland. This speech cemented his status as the man of the hour, the patriot who could summon courage from the jaws of defeat. The following spring, in 1793, the revolution once again found itself on the brink of utter collapse. The execution of King Louis XVI in January had sent shockwaves across Europe, leading Great Britain and other nations to join the war against France. The French armies, which had enjoyed surprising victories in the autumn of 1792, were now suffering a series of catastrophic defeats. The celebrated General Dumouriez, a hero of the earlier battles, defected to the Austrians, a stunning act of treason that sowed deep mistrust of the entire military command. Within France itself, civil war was erupting. A massive, religiously motivated royalist peasant revolt broke out in the Vendée region of western France, while several major provincial cities, resentful of Paris's radical dominance, began to rebel against the central government in what became known as the Federalist revolts. Food shortages were rampant, the currency was collapsing, and the government seemed incapable of mastering the simultaneous threats from within and without. The central question became starkly terrifying. How does a revolution, founded on the principles of liberty and individual rights, create a governmental body powerful enough and feared enough to save the nation from total disintegration? The answer, in a moment of supreme historical irony, would lie with Danton, the man who had so often championed the popular will. Recognizing that the sprawling, fractious national convention was too unwieldy and slow to respond to the rapidly escalating crises, Danton seized the political moment. He argued passionately for the creation of a new executive body, a small, centralized war cabinet that would be vested with extraordinary powers to act swiftly and decisively. This proposed body would bypass the endless debates and procedural delays of the larger assembly, allowing it to take the ruthless and efficient measures necessary to defend the Republic. On April 6, 1793, Danton successfully championed the creation of this new entity, the Committee of Public Safety. It was conceived as a temporary emergency measure, a necessary evil to navigate the storm. Few at the time could have predicted that this committee, born of Danton's pragmatic desperation, would evolve into the most powerful and feared instrument of state terror in French history. As the first and most dominant member of the newly formed Committee of Public Safety, Danton revealed the core of his political character. He was, above all, a pragmatist, not a utopian idealist in the mold of his contemporary Maximilien Robespierre. Danton's primary objective was not to meticulously construct a republic of virtue based on abstract philosophical principles, but to achieve the tangible, immediate goal of saving France from its enemies. He was a statesman of action, not of theory. He was willing to negotiate with political opponents, to make compromises, and most critically, to use whatever means were necessary to secure the survival of the Republic. This included advocating for measures that were brutal and coercive. He saw the state's power as a tool, an instrument to be wielded with ruthless efficiency in times of crisis. While Robespierre was increasingly obsessed with ideological purity and the souls of the citizenry, Danton was focused on the borders, the armies, and the crushing of internal rebellion. This fundamental difference in their political temperament, pragmatism versus idealism, would eventually place them on a fatal collision course. During his tenure as the head of the committee, Danton's leadership was characterized by a whirlwind of activity aimed at stabilizing the nation. He worked tirelessly to reorganize the war effort, to raise new armies, and to supply them with the resources they needed to fight. He engaged in secret diplomacy, attempting to peel away members of the enemy coalition and secure a negotiated peace that would allow the Republic to consolidate itself. He understood that the revolution could not survive a perpetual war against all of Europe. At the same time, he recognized the need to appease the radical elements in Paris, the sans-culottes, whose support was essential for the government's stability. He therefore supported key economic measures they demanded, such as price controls on essential goods, known as the maximum, even if they conflicted with his own more moderate economic beliefs. In all these actions, Danton displayed a remarkable flexibility and a focus on practical results over ideological consistency. He was trying to steer the ship of state through a hurricane, using every tool at his disposal to keep it from foundering. The creation of the Committee of Public Safety and other emergency measures, such as the Revolutionary Tribunal, marked the beginning of the institutionalization of what would become the Reign of Terror. The central, horrifying question that the revolutionaries now faced, whether they acknowledged it or not, was this: to save the Republic and its promise of liberty, did they first have to drown it in the blood of its enemies? The guillotine, which had been introduced as a more humane method of execution, began to accelerate its relentless work in the Place de la Révolution. Initially, the targets were clear enemies of the state, royalists, traitorous generals, and counter-revolutionary spies. For a time, this brutal justice seemed to many, including Danton, to be a grim but necessary response to the existential threats facing the nation. He famously justified these measures by declaring, "Let us be terrible," to prevent the people from being so, arguing that organized, state-sanctioned terror was preferable to the chaotic, anarchic mob violence of the previous year's September massacres. The state, he believed, must monopolize violence to control it. However, as the spring and summer of 1793 wore on, the definition of an enemy of the revolution began to expand alarmingly. The law of suspects, passed in September, cast a chillingly wide net, allowing for the arrest of individuals based on ambiguous criteria such as their conduct, their associations, or their expressed opinions. The tumbrils, the wooden carts used to transport the condemned to the guillotine, began to carry not just aristocrats and royalists, but also fellow revolutionaries from rival factions like the Girondins, who were purged from the convention in June. As the number of victims mounted, Danton's conviction in the necessity of the terror began to crack. What had started as a targeted weapon of national defense was morphing into an indiscriminate instrument of political purification. The initial pragmatic justification was giving way to an ideological crusade driven by the paranoid logic that any dissent, any moderation, was tantamount to treason. Danton, a man who loved life in all its messy complexity, started to see the revolution becoming a cold, unforgiving machine of death. The endless spectacle of bloodshed, the daily processions to the scaffold, and the atmosphere of pervasive suspicion began to weigh heavily on Danton's soul. He grew increasingly and visibly disgusted by the carnage he had helped to legitimize. This was not the vibrant, life-affirming republic he had envisioned. The joy and energy of the early revolutionary festivals had been replaced by the grim silence of the crowds watching the guillotine's blade fall. Danton's booming voice, which had once called for audacity and action, began to be raised in private and then more openly in calls for restraint and a return to legal norms. He started to believe that the system of terror, having served its emergency purpose of repelling the initial invasion and quelling the worst of the revolts, was now becoming a greater threat to the Republic than the enemies it was designed to destroy. It was creating a society based on fear, not liberty, and was alienating the very people the revolution was supposed to serve. The pragmatist in him saw that the policy was yielding diminishing returns and creating dangerous new instabilities. Exhausted by the political infighting and deeply troubled by the escalating bloodshed, Danton made a fateful decision in the autumn of 1793. Believing the Republic was now on a more stable footing, he effectively resigned from the now Robespierre-dominated Committee of Public Safety and sought refuge from the very political storm he had helped to unleash. He retreated to his country home in Arcis-sur-Aube with his new young wife, seeking solace in a domestic life he had long neglected. It was an attempt to step away from the carnage, to cleanse his spirit, and perhaps to distance himself from the excesses he could no longer support. But in the hyper-politicized and paranoid atmosphere of revolutionary Paris, there was no such thing as a neutral retreat. To his enemies, particularly those on the far left, his withdrawal was seen not as a sign of exhaustion, but as a dereliction of duty, a suspicious abandonment of his post. To Robespierre and his allies, it was evidence of a weakening of revolutionary zeal, a sign of a dangerous moderation that threatened to undermine the entire project of national purification. The lion of the revolution could not simply walk away from the arena. His absence was as conspicuous and as political as his presence. When Danton returned to Paris late in 1793, it was clear to all that he was a changed man. The firebrand who had called for audacity at any cost was gone. In his place was a statesman now arguing for a new kind of courage, the courage of mercy. His booming voice, which had once rallied the people to storm a palace, no longer called for vengeance, but for reconciliation and an end to the terror. He and his political allies, including the gifted journalist Camille Desmoulins, became the nucleus of a new faction that would be derisively labelled the Indulgents. They argued that with the French armies now victorious on all fronts and the major internal rebellions crushed, the time for wholesale execution was over. It was time to release the thousands of political prisoners languishing in the city's jails, to dismantle the emergency dictatorship of the Committee of Public Safety, and to begin the process of healing the fractured nation. This call for clemency was not just a political strategy. It was a profound moral and philosophical challenge to the very foundation of Robespierre's government. The political stage was now set for a titanic and inevitable confrontation. What happens when the revolution's pragmatic, life-affirming heart, embodied by Danton, clashes directly with its incorruptible, fanatical, and theoretical mind, personified by Maximilien Robespierre? This was more than just a political disagreement. It was a fundamental conflict between two opposing worldviews, two irreconcilable visions for the future of France. Danton, who believed the revolution was a means to achieve a better, freer life for the French people, now felt that its primary goals had been secured. For him, the emergency was over. Robespierre, however, believed that the military victories were merely the prelude to the true revolution, a complete moral and spiritual transformation of society into a republic of virtue, a process that required the unyielding continuation of the terror to eliminate all corruption, all dissent, and all moral weakness. Their struggle would become the central drama of the winter of 1793-1794, a battle for the very soul of the French Revolution. The friendship that had once existed between Danton and Robespierre, two of the original giants of the Jacobin Club, was destined to be shattered and ultimately end in blood. Their personal lives and characters were a study in stark contrasts. Danton was a man of the earth, a lover of worldly pleasures who was frequently dogged by accusations of financial corruption. He was loud, messy, passionate, and deeply human in his flaws and appetites. Robespierre was his complete opposite. Known as the Incorruptible, he lived a life of austere simplicity, driven by an unwavering and rigid belief in the abstract concept of virtue. He was meticulous, cold and suspicious of the very human passions that Danton so readily embraced. What had once been a difference in style and temperament now escalated into a chasm of ideological and personal animosity. The political became profoundly personal, as Robespierre began to see Danton's calls for mercy not as a legitimate policy debate, but as the corrupt plea of a morally compromised man seeking to protect his decadent and criminal friends. Their clash played out in the halls of the Convention and in the influential Jacobin Club. Danton, with his allies, argued forcefully that the terror must end. He pointed to the victorious armies and the pacified countryside as proof that the emergency powers were no longer necessary. He warned that the continuation of the terror was alienating the population and creating a climate of fear that was antithetical to the very idea of a republic. He famously declared, "I would rather be guillotined than guillotine others." Robespierre, in response, argued with chilling conviction that the terror was more essential than ever. To relax the pressure now, he claimed, would be to allow the vicious and the corrupt to undo all the gains of the revolution. He believed the terror was not merely a tool of war, but a necessary instrument for forging a new, virtuous French citizen. For Robespierre, anyone who sought to halt this process was, by definition, an enemy of the Republic. The disagreement was absolute and irreconcilable, and it rapidly devolved into a bitter personal hatred that would have only one possible outcome in the zero-sum game of revolutionary politics. Robespierre, the master political strategist, understood that a direct attack on a figure as popular and formidable as Danton was fraught with risk. To trap a lion, he knew he must first eliminate the other predators in the jungle, clearing the political field and isolating his primary target. His first move was against the ultra-radicals to his left, the faction known as the Hébertists. Led by the vitriolic journalist Jacques Hébert, they were a powerful force among the Parisian sans-culottes and were constantly agitating for an even more extreme and bloody terror, even accusing the Committee of Public Safety of being too soft. In March 1794, Robespierre and the committee struck, arresting Hébert and his leading followers. They were charged with plotting an insurrection, and after a swift trial were sent to the guillotine. This move was celebrated by Danton and his indulgent allies, who saw it as a decisive blow against the most fanatical elements of the revolution. Danton and the indulgents, in their relief at the fall of the Hébertists, made a catastrophic political miscalculation. They foolishly believed that this purge signaled a turn towards moderation, a sign that Robespierre and the committee were finally ready to rein in the excesses of the terror. They celebrated what they perceived as a victory for their cause, believing that the revolution was at last correcting its own course. They saw this as the beginning of the end of the bloodletting, the first step towards a return to normalcy. They failed to comprehend Robespierre's cold, methodical logic. The elimination of the Hébertists was not a move towards the center. It was a classic political maneuver to eliminate one flank of the opposition before turning to crush the other. By removing the ultra-radicals, Robespierre had also removed the one group that might have defended Danton as a fellow revolutionary, albeit a moderate one. He had left Danton and the indulgents exposed and vulnerable, their calls for clemency now sounding like the most extreme form of dissent in a newly narrowed political landscape. In the days that followed the execution of the Hébertists, the political atmosphere in Paris grew thick with rumor and menace. The shadow of the guillotine now seemed to loom directly over Danton himself. His friends, sensing the imminent danger, pleaded with him to take action. They urged him to flee Paris, to escape to a neutral country like Switzerland, or to launch a preemptive strike against Robespierre in the Convention, using his immense oratorical power to denounce the committee before they could move against him. Danton, in a display of tragic arrogance and fatal underestimation of his foe, laughed off these warnings. He could not fathom that the revolution he had done so much to save would dare to turn on him, its most fearless champion. "They will not dare," he famously and repeatedly declared, a statement born of a deep-seated belief in his own indispensability and popularity. He felt he was an icon, a living symbol of the Republic, and that to strike him down would be an act of political suicide for his enemies. He believed, until the very last moment, that he was simply untouchable. While Danton reassured himself with his own legendary status, his fate was being sealed in secret, not through public debate, but through whispers in the dark, secluded rooms of the Committee of Public Safety. The primary architect of his legal destruction was Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, Robespierre's young, handsome, and fanatically devoted protégé. Known as the Angel of Death, Saint-Just was tasked with drafting the formal indictment against Danton and his allies. The resulting document was not a sober legal argument, but a masterpiece of political malice and rhetorical inversion. It masterfully twisted Danton's every known vice, his love of money, his rumored corruption, his periods of inaction, his calls for mercy, into a coherent narrative of treason. His wealth was presented as proof of bribes from foreign powers, his pragmatism as a lack of revolutionary faith, and his desire to end the terror as a traitorous plot to restore the monarchy. The indictment was a chillingly effective piece of character assassination designed to destroy his reputation before he even set foot in the courtroom. The carefully crafted report by Saint-Just was presented to a joint session of the Committees of Public Safety and General Security. Even in this room of hardened revolutionaries, the decision to move against Danton was not an easy one. He was a colossal figure, a man many of them had admired and fought alongside. However, a potent combination of genuine ideological fervor and raw personal fear ultimately convinced them that he had to be eliminated. Robespierre and Saint-Just argued passionately that Danton's moderate faction represented a mortal threat to the unity and purpose of the revolution. They painted him as the leader of a conspiracy of the indulgent that would open the gates to counter-revolution. For some on the committees, this ideological argument was enough. For others, the motivation was simpler and more primal: fear. They feared Robespierre's power and his unwavering conviction, and they feared that if they did not stand with him against Danton, they themselves could be next on the list of the suspect. In the end, the warrant for the arrest of George Danton and his closest allies was signed. The question of how to arrest a living legend was a delicate one. Danton was not just a politician. He was a popular hero, especially in his home district of the Cordeliers. A public arrest during the daytime could easily have sparked a riot, an insurrection in his defense. The committees understood this danger perfectly. The only way to succeed was with speed, stealth, and surprise. They chose to act in the dead of night, hoping to seize their target while he slept, ensuring that the lion of the revolution would not have time to roar and summon his supporters. In the early hours of March 30, 1794, the trap was sprung. Gendarmes surrounded Danton's home. He was awakened, arrested, and transported, along with his arrested friends, to the Luxembourg Palace, which had been converted into a prison. The news of his arrest spread through a stunned Paris at dawn like a seismic shockwave. People could scarcely believe what they were hearing. Danton, the man of August 10th, the voice that had rallied France against invasion, accused of being a traitor. To the average citizen, the idea seemed utterly, terrifyingly impossible. The trial of Danton and his co-accused, which began on April 2nd, was never intended to be a fair legal proceeding. It was a political show trial designed for one purpose: to publicly execute a rival faction. But the authorities had gravely underestimated their principal defendant. From the moment he entered the courtroom of the Revolutionary Tribunal, Danton refused to play the part of a condemned man. He was not a meek defendant. He was a political storm, a force of nature railing against his own destruction. When asked for his name and residence, he boomed in response, "My residence will soon be in nothingness, but my name will live on in the pantheon of history." He challenged the legitimacy of the court, mocked his accusers, and demanded that his witnesses be called. His voice, that legendary instrument of power, was so strong that it carried out of the courtroom windows and into the streets, where a massive and increasingly sympathetic crowd had gathered, drawn by the sound of their hero fighting for his life. Danton's powerful and defiant defense began to turn the tide. He systematically dismantled the flimsy evidence presented against him, exposing the charges as a tissue of lies and personal vendettas. The jury, composed of supposedly reliable Jacobins, was visibly wavering. The crowd outside grew more agitated, their murmurs of support for Danton growing louder. The president of the tribunal, Herman, and the chief prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, were losing control. They sent panicked notes to the Committee of Public Safety, warning them that the trial was spinning out of control and that they could not guarantee a guilty verdict. It seemed for a moment that Danton's sheer force of will might be powerful enough to bring down the very court that was judging him, and perhaps the committee itself. He was putting the terror on trial, and against all odds, he appeared to be winning. The committee was faced with a terrifying prospect: Danton's acquittal, which would almost certainly lead to their own downfall and execution. Faced with this potential disaster, the Committee of Public Safety resorted to an act of breathtaking cynicism and tyranny. If they could not sentence a man they were unable to silence, they would simply change the law in the middle of his trial to make silencing him legal. This desperate act, designed solely to guarantee his death, was orchestrated once again by the ruthless Saint-Just. He raced to the National Convention and took the floor, breathlessly claiming to have uncovered a prison plot in which Danton and his allies were conspiring with an insurrection to overthrow the government. With the convention cowed into submission, Saint-Just proposed a new decree. Any defendant who insulted the dignity of justice or resisted the court could be removed from the proceedings and condemned in their absence. The decree was passed instantly and without debate by the terrified deputies. It was rushed back to the Revolutionary Tribunal, where the president immediately read it aloud. Danton, Desmoulins, and their allies were accused of having insulted the court with their vigorous defense, and they were denied the right to speak any further. The trial was over. The verdict was now a foregone conclusion. On April 5, 1794, after the farcical guilty verdict was delivered, George Danton began his final journey. He and his condemned friends were loaded onto the tumbrils for the short, jarring ride to the Place de la Révolution and the guillotine. Throughout this final ordeal, he displayed no fear, only a defiant and profound contempt for the men who had orchestrated his murder. He reportedly offered words of comfort to his distraught friends, maintaining his composure and courage to the very end. As the cart passed the home where Robespierre lived, Danton is said to have stood and roared a final prophetic curse. "Robespierre, you will follow me." It was the last roar of the dying lion, a prediction that would prove to be uncannily accurate. He was a titan, even in his final moments, determined to face the very machine his revolution had perfected with his head held high. Upon reaching the scaffold, Danton's defiance did not waver. He remained a commanding presence, a historical figure, acutely aware that his last words would be recorded for posterity. As he watched his friend Hérault de Séchelles approach the executioner for a final embrace, they were pushed apart. Danton rebuked the guard with a sad irony. "You fools! You can't prevent our heads from meeting in the basket." When his own turn came, he stood before the executioner, Sanson, and gave him one final, unforgettable instruction, a command that was both arrogant and magnificent. "Don't forget to show my head to the people," he ordered. "It is well worth seeing." With those defiant last words, the blade fell, and the thundering voice of the revolution was silenced forever. With Danton and the indulgence eliminated, did the terror finally, as they had wished, come to an end? The answer was a catastrophic and resounding no. Danton had acted as a kind of gravitational force, a political counterweight to Robespierre's extremism. With that counterweight now gone, the engine of death, now completely unopposed, did not slow down. It accelerated into its most intense and bloody phase. The period that followed Danton's execution, from June to July 1794, became known as the Great Terror. A new law was passed that stripped defendants of any remaining rights, including the right to a defense lawyer, and made death the only possible punishment. The guillotines of Paris began working faster than ever before, executing well over 1,000 people in just a few short weeks. The revolution, deprived of its voice of moderation, descended into a horrifying parody of its own ideals. By eliminating his greatest and most formidable rival, Robespierre had achieved absolute power, but in doing so, he had also made a fatal strategic error. He had silenced the one man who might have been able to bridge the gap between the Radical Committee and the increasingly weary and fearful National Convention. Without Danton to act as a buffer or a target, Robespierre himself became the sole and terrifying focus of everyone's fear. Every deputy in the convention, no matter how loyal they had been, now looked at Robespierre and wondered if they might be next. He stood alone, a lonely and isolated target at the pinnacle of power, surrounded not by allies, but by men who feared him too much to let him live. His position was, in reality, incredibly fragile. He had made himself the personification of the terror, and as the nation grew sick of the bloodshed, they would inevitably turn against the man they held responsible. Danton's final prophecy, screamed from the tumbril, would come true with astonishing speed. Just under 4 months after Danton's execution, in late July 1794, the month of Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, a conspiracy of deputies in the National Convention, terrified for their own lives, rose up against Robespierre, shouting him down with cries of "Down with the tyrant!" They voted for his arrest. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and their remaining allies were cornered and, after a brief and violent struggle, were arrested. The very next day, without a trial, the incorruptible himself was taken to the Place de la Révolution and met his fate at the same guillotine to which he had sent Danton. His fall marked the effective end of the reign of terror and the beginning of a new, more conservative phase of the revolution. Danton's name, as he had predicted, was destined for the pantheon of history, but the question of how a man executed as a traitor could later become a national hero was only just beginning to be asked. In the aftermath of Robespierre's fall and the end of the terror, a period known as the Thermidorian reaction began. France, exhausted by years of radicalism, fear, and bloodshed, started to re-examine the immediate past and its fallen titans. In this new, more moderate political climate, Danton's reputation began a slow but steady process of rehabilitation. He was no longer seen simply as the corrupt traitor depicted in Saint-Just's indictment. Instead, people began to remember him as the patriot of 1792, the man whose energy had saved the nation from invasion. His call to end the terror was now reinterpreted not as an act of treason, but as an act of foresight and courage, a desperate attempt to steer the revolution back towards a more humane path. Statues were eventually erected in his honor, and streets were named after him. He was posthumously restored to his place as one of the great heroes of the Republic, a complex figure who represented a more pragmatic and life-affirming alternative to Robespierre's deadly pursuit of virtue. To this day, the legacy of George Danton remains complex, powerful, and intensely debated by historians. Was he a selfless patriot or a corrupt opportunist? Was he the savior of the Republic or one of the architects of the terror that nearly destroyed it? The truth is that he was likely all of these things at once. Danton embodies the raw, messy, powerful, and deeply contradictory energy of revolution itself. He demonstrates a capacity for both heroic, nation-building creation and for brutal, pragmatic destruction. He is a reminder that revolutions are not made by saints or philosophers alone, but by flawed, ambitious, and passionate human beings. His life serves as a timeless warning about the intoxicating allure of power, the ease with which revolutionary means can corrupt revolutionary ends, and the terrifying speed at which a revolution, in its quest for a perfect future, can turn on and devour its own creators. His name, just as he predicted, lives on, not as a simple hero, but as a complex and tragic symbol of the glorious and terrible power of the human will to reshape the world.